Picture this. It's a peaceful Sunday morning in Hawaii, December 7th, 1941. The sun is just rising over Pearl Harbor, casting golden light across the calm waters where America's mighty Pacific Fleet sits at anchor. Sailors are sleeping in, some preparing for church services, others writing letters home. The USS Arizona sits proudly on Battleship Row, her massive guns silent, her crew of over 1,500 men beginning another ordinary day. But 230 miles north of this paradise, a nightmare is about to unfold. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, carrying 414 planes, are approaching through the darkness. At 6 a.m., the first wave of bombers lifts off into the pre-dawn sky. In less than 2 hours, this peaceful morning will become what President Roosevelt called a date which will live in infamy. Over 2,400 Americans will be dead. The USS Arizona will be an underwater tomb, and the world will be thrust into a global war that will consume millions of lives. This is the story of Japan's ultimate gamble, a desperate roll of the dice that they believed would secure their empire, but instead sealed their doom. To understand why Japan made this fateful decision, we need to go back to the 1930s. Japan had spent decades modernizing, desperately wanting to join the ranks of the great imperial powers like Britain and the United States. But there was one massive problem. Japan had virtually no natural resources. No oil, no steel, no rubber. Everything they needed to build their empire had to be imported. In 1931, Japan took its first major step, invading the Chinese province of Manchuria. Then in 1937, they launched a full-scale invasion of China. At first, the Japanese steamrolled through Chinese defenses, but by 1939, the war had become a bloody stalemate that was draining Japan's resources faster than they could replace them. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, America was watching with growing alarm. The American public had been deeply isolationist after World War I. We wanted nothing to do with foreign wars. But as Japanese atrocities mounted, including the horrific rape of Nanking, where hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians were murdered, American opinion began to shift. Here's where the tragedy begins to unfold. In July 1940, President Roosevelt imposed the first sanctions on Japan, cutting off scrap metal and aviation fuel exports. Japan responded by moving into French Indochina, aligning themselves with Nazi Germany. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, each side making moves that pushed them closer to an inevitable collision. Then came the moment that sealed Japan's fate. In July 1941, Japanese forces moved deeper into Indochina, preparing to strike south toward the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. Roosevelt's response was devastating. He froze all Japanese assets in America and imposed a complete oil embargo. Britain and the Netherlands quickly followed suit. Overnight, Japan lost 94% of its oil supply. Think about that moment. Admiral Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, understood exactly what this meant. He had studied at Harvard, had lived in America. He knew the industrial might of the United States. And yet, faced with this embargo, Japan's leaders believed they had only 2 choices: surrender their imperial ambitions completely, or go to war with the most powerful nation on earth. They chose war. But here's the crucial detail that many people don't understand. Japan never believed they could actually defeat the United States in a long war. Their entire strategy was built on a desperate gamble. They thought, if we can cripple the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, buy ourselves 6 months to a year, maybe the Americans won't have the stomach for a long, bloody war across the Pacific. Maybe they'll negotiate for peace. It was the most catastrophic miscalculation in military history. At 3:30 a.m. on December 7th, the Japanese task force reached their launch point. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the first wave of attackers, climbed into his bomber, knowing that the next few hours would determine the fate of nations. As the sun rose over Oahu, American sailors were going about their Sunday routines. On the USS Arizona, 23-year-old Seaman First Class Donald Stratton was preparing for the morning watch. In the harbor's machine shops, mechanics were performing routine maintenance. At the airfields, American planes sat wingtip to wingtip, perfectly arranged to prevent sabotage, but creating perfect targets for attack. At 7:53 a.m., Fuchida's voice crackled over the radio. "Tora, Tora, Tora! Tiger, Tiger, Tiger!" The code word meaning complete surprise had been achieved. What happened next was catastrophic. Japanese torpedo bombers, using specially designed shallow water torpedoes, struck Battleship Row with devastating precision. Within minutes, the USS Oklahoma began to capsize. Seaman Stephen Bauer Young found himself trapped inside the overturning hull, the water rising around him and his shipmates as they fought desperately to escape. At 8:06 a.m., the USS Arizona took a direct hit to her forward magazine. The explosion was so massive, it lifted the 32,000-ton battleship entirely out of the water. Petty Officer Sterling Cale, stationed nearby, watched in horror as his friends disappeared in a ball of fire. Of the Arizona's 1,512 crew members, 1,177 died in that single terrible moment. Donald Stratton, burned over 70% of his body, only survived because a sailor from the nearby repair ship USS Vestal threw him a rope line. As Stratton later wrote, "I could see my shipmates everywhere in the water, some alive, some not. The harbor was covered with oil and fire. It looked like hell itself." The attack lasted just 110 minutes, but its impact would reshape the world. In Washington, President Roosevelt was having lunch when Navy Secretary Frank Knox called with the devastating news. As Roosevelt absorbed the scale of the disaster, he began drafting what would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. The next day, standing before Congress, Roosevelt declared December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, and asked for a declaration of war. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only one member of Congress voted against war. But here's the tragic irony that I think about often. Pearl Harbor was simultaneously Japan's greatest tactical success and their ultimate strategic disaster. Yes, they had crippled the battleship fleet. Yes, they had bought themselves time to conquer Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. Within months, Japanese forces controlled territory from the Aleutian Islands to the edge of Australia. But they had also awakened something they couldn't control. The attack unified America like nothing since the Civil War. Isolationism died in the flames of Pearl Harbor. Millions of Americans rushed to enlist. The entire industrial might of the United States, the factories, the resources, the determination, was now focused on one goal: total victory over Japan. Admiral Yamamoto himself reportedly said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he actually said those exact words or not, the sentiment was prophetic. The Japanese had gambled everything on America, lacking the will to fight a long, bloody war in the Pacific. Instead, they ensured that America would fight with unprecedented determination until Japan surrendered unconditionally. When I walk through Pearl Harbor today, what strikes me most is how one moment, one decision, can change everything. The sailors who died that morning, most of them were barely out of their teens. They woke up thinking about breakfast, about letters from home, about shore leave. They had no idea they were about to become part of history. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. Within 4 years, American forces would be accepting Japan's surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, a surrender signed just a few hundred yards from where the USS Arizona still rests on the harbor floor. The story of Pearl Harbor reminds us that the world we live in today was shaped by these moments of crisis, by individual acts of courage and sacrifice. The freedom we enjoy, the alliances we depend on, the very fact that democracy survived the 20th century, it all traces back to that Sunday morning when America's isolationism died in the flames of Pearl Harbor. In our next episode, we'll explore how America's entry into World War II changed everything, not just for the war, but for the entire course of the 20th century. Because the sleeping giant that Japan awakened would become the dominant global power for generations to come. This has been The Story Arc, where we connect the past to the present. I'm your host, and I'll see you next time.